It should be closer. So baby, pull me closer in the backseat of your Rover. And you need a haircut because you can't even see when your hair's in your eyes. Alright, off with you then. Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. This is Unapologetic Skincare and Beauty and I'm Stephanie. Today I have a little bit of a special video for you. Wednesday is Halloween and I wanted to do a kind of Halloween themed video, but I also wanted to keep it like historically accurate. Not go too crazy with the ghosts and spirits because you don't know me that well yet. I don't want to freak you out. So I decided to do a video about the Spiritualist Movement, which began in upstate New York in the 1800s. I'm in the process now of finishing up my Mystery Monday video, which will be posted on Monday as usual, so keep a lookout for that. But today, let's go back in time, let's have a little fun, let's be a little spooky, and let's have a little Halloween kind of cheer, right? Halloween cheer, is that a thing? It is today. So to understand the Spiritualist movement, you have to understand the house where it started. It was a small town in Hydesville, New York, which is currently called Arcadia, New York, about 40 miles outside of Rochester, New York. This house was occupied by a couple that were named the Bells, Mr. and Mrs. Bell, and they also had a maid who worked with them, and her name was Lucrezia. Sometime between the years of 1833 and 1844, a traveling salesman came to the Bells' home selling odds and ends, kitchen supplies, knives, pots, pans, things like that. He actually stayed with the Bells for a little while, and it was even rumored that he and Mrs. Bell had something of an inappropriate relationship. Shortly after the peddler came to stay with the Bells, Lucrezia was let go, and there was no hard feelings, I guess. She understood that that's just the way things went sometimes. But before she left, she purchased a small kitchen knife from the traveling salesman and gave him instructions on where to deliver it at her father's home. The knife and the peddler never showed up to Lucrezia's house. Oh, it's so hot. So about a week later, Lucrezia was brought back to the Bell home to work there. Her services were again requested, and since she needed the money and was grateful to have a job, she didn't really question it. But when she got there, she realized that the peddler was gone, but a number of his things that he was selling were still there, like all of the things that he was selling. Lucrezia, once again, just happy to have a job again, happy to be employed again, assumed Mrs. Bell had purchased the stuff from the salesman and didn't really question it. But then strange things started to happen. Knockings and tappings would come from the room that the peddler had been occupying while he stayed with the Bells. When anyone went in the room to see what the knocking and tapping and all the noise was about, it would show that the room was unoccupied. There was nobody in there. Lucrezia would find herself alone in the home and just hear footsteps walking around the house and then walking down the stairs to the cellar. She was freaked out, understandably. She didn't want to be alone in the house anymore, so she would have friends and family come and stay with her when the Bells weren't there and she was alone. Sometimes when she had company, the strange occurrences and noises would stop. On one occasion, the rappings and tappings and thumpings just went on for hours, and it scared Lucrezia's brother so much that he left the Bell home and he vowed he was never ever going to return to that house again. And there was that one time Lucrezia reported that she was down in the cellar and she tripped over basically a pile of newly upturned dirt. When she asked Mr. Bell what it was because she had hurt herself when she tripped over it, he said, "Don't worry about that. It was just dirt we were using to fill up holes from rats." Shortly after all this crazy stuff is happening, the Bells moved out and a family called the Weekmans moved in, but the Weekmans, they didn't stay long either. It started when an acquaintance of theirs, Mrs. Laugh, she entered the kitchen and saw a figure of a man standing there in a black overcoat, basically an apparition, a ghost. The figure disappeared when she screamed in terror, but she was obviously very shook by this. The family began to then hear the rappings and tappings and the trademark occurrences of the ghost, the same that Lucrezia had heard when she lived in the Bell home, and they mostly happened at night, and it prevented the family from getting a really good night's rest, so they took off and they left as well. Then the Fox family moved in. I can only assume that before the Fox family moved into this home, they had already heard rumblings or grumblings of the house being haunted, that they had already heard stories about what was happening in the house. I can only assume that since there's no evidence or any kind of reports saying that they knew that people thought the house was haunted before they moved into it. John Fox was a Canadian farmer who had come to New York to start a farm. So he had purchased quite a bit of land in Hydesville, and the cottage that they were going to be staying in, he and his family, it was just a temporary residence while a house was being built on the land they'd bought for their farm. The family consisted of John Fox, his wife, and their 2 daughters, Margaret and Kate. Within only a few days of the family moving in, the noises started. Banging, rattling, thumping. John Fox, who was not a superstitious man, this is a religious, God-fearing man. He didn't believe in ghosts. He thought it was just his daughters and his wife overreacting, that they were, in a new place, in a new environment, in a new home. Maybe their imaginations were running wild. He just wrote it off as them being sensitive to the sounds and the settling of being in a new home. But one night, Kate woke up screaming, claiming that a cold hand had reached out and touched her face in the middle of the night. And Margaret claimed that invisible hands had roughly torn the covers off of her bed while she was in it. Even his wife admitted that she could hear footsteps wandering about the house and walking down the stairs into the cellar. Once again, Mr. Fox, he was a no-nonsense, practical sort of man. So he went around the house looking for an explanation that would logically explain where these noises were coming from. So he would go around knocking on walls, tapping on floorboards, just kind of opening and closing doors to see if any weird noises were happening or if that was causing noises. And he couldn't find anything. So on March 31st, he went around beginning his nightly ritual of knocking on floorboards, checking for anything that would be making weird noises or causing his wife and his daughters to think this house was haunted. And as he was doing that, he and his daughter Kate were alone in a room, and he was basically knocking on floorboards. And she noticed that as he would knock on a floorboard or a door or the wall, a knocking or thumping would respond. At this point, Kate called out the unseen spirit. She and her sister Margaret had given him a nickname since they had become so acquainted with him over the time of being in the house and being allegedly haunted by him, and they called him Mr. Splitfoot. Kate calls out, "Here, Mr. Splitfoot, do as I do," before clapping her hands together 2 times. Seconds later, 2 knocks from the inside wall responded. Mrs. Fox and Margaret were in a different room, and they heard the commotion going on in the room that Kate and her father were in, so they ran in to basically take part in this sort of impromptu seance. Mrs. Fox would ask the spirit, Mr. Splitfoot, questions to see if he was the real deal. If he was a spirit, he would know the answers to these questions. So she asked him the ages of all her children, and he responded back correctly. And he even knocked the correct age of a child that the Foxes had lost, who had died. The family at this point was understandably pretty spooked, so Mr. Fox kind of went to the neighboring houses around him, grabbed some neighbors, saying, "There's something weird going on in my house. I think we're talking to a ghost. Can you come on over and check it out?" And everybody he was talking to was skeptical at this point, right? People didn't believe in this stuff. You shouldn't believe in this stuff. This didn't really go along with the Protestant religion that most people in that times followed. They didn't talk to spirits, they didn't believe in ghosts, and everybody just kind of went along with it, but didn't expect really to be convinced of the spirit's existence. But the neighbors did gather in the Fox's home, and they asked Mr. Splitfoot a series of their own questions, and most of the answers were pretty spot on. At that point, most of these neighbors were converted into believers. They actually developed a code with the spirit in which he could respond in more than just yes or no or numerical terms. And using this code, they established that Mr. Splitfoot, their unseen guest, was actually the spirit of a murdered traveling salesman who had been buried underneath that house. Now, coincidentally, one of the neighbors who had been gathered in the Fox home that night was Lucrezia Pulver, the very same maid who had worked for the Bells many years ago when the traveling salesman had come to stay with them and then had disappeared. So she told Mr. Fox the story about the upturned dirt that she had tripped over in the cellar, and he and another neighbor went down to investigate, and they kind of did some digging, They weren't really finding anything, but after an hour, they found a bone fragment that appeared to have hair still attached to it, and that kind of freaked them out, but it also spurred them on to keep digging. But they didn't really find anything else besides some ragged pieces of clothes. No more bones, no skeleton, no signs of anybody being buried under the house besides that bone fragment with the hair still attached. But they did have a doctor look at that bone fragment, and he did confirm that it was at one time part of a human skull. So at this point, with the weird disturbances that were going on, the communication with the spirit, and confirmation of a bone fragment that had once belonged to a human skull buried underneath the house, the Foxes and their neighbors were kind of convinced that the house was being haunted by the spirit of a traveling salesman who had been murdered and buried under the house. Mr. and Mrs. Fox did not want to stay in the house, so they moved out of the little cottage and moved into the house that they were building on their farmland. And they sent Kate and Margaret to live with their sister Leah, their older sister Leah, who lived in Rochester, New York. To understand how spiritualism took hold so quickly in that time and place, you really have to understand the religious climate of the Finger Lakes region in that time. Rochester, New York was literally boiling over with religious reform. People looking for a new way, a different way, and a better way than what they had been taught and brought up with. This area has always been known for its religious reform. It gave birth to religions such as Mormonism and Seventh-day Adventism. So it wasn't surprising to me when I discovered that spiritualism was also born and bred in upstate New York. So now that Kate and Margaret were living with their older sister Leah in Rochester, New York, they were introduced to the people in the community. Isaac and Amy Post, who were radical Hicksite Quakers and were also community leaders in the area, they became interested in the sisters and what they could do. I'll go over really quickly what a Hicksite Quaker is. A Hicksite Quaker is basically a branch of people that split off from the original Quaker religion. These people were typically poorer than their Orthodox counterparts, and they lived in more rural areas, whereas the Orthodox Quakers typically lived in like the cities, more populated areas. The Hicksites also believed in the light within. They dismissed the Bible entirely. They really believed in, self-determination. They weren't all about ceremonies and, having to talk with a priest to give a confession. They really believed that God was within everybody and you could practice your religion anywhere you wanted. That each person had the power within themselves to communicate with God in any way, in any place, and any time that they chose to. Hicksites also tended strongly towards political movements. So they were often involved in the abolitionist movement and women's rights and all those kinds of political movements that were happening at that time. Because of this open-minded, egalitarian philosophy, it's no wonder that Isaac and Amy Post became interested in the Fox sisters, who they had heard had the ability to communicate beyond the physical body, that they could talk to the spirit world. They were women, and Hicksite Quakers were very interested in keeping women in positions of power and importance in the community, and they basically proved everything about their religion, that everybody has within them the ability to talk to God or go beyond the physical world. Kate and Margaret were invited to the Post's home where they would be able to see for themselves whether their reputation was warranted, whether they could actually do what they said they could do, or if it was just a hoax. They were both intelligent people, Isaac and Amy, so they obviously went into it with a skeptical mind. Even though they wanted to believe it, they went into it with a skeptical mind. They came out of this show convinced, though. They witnessed for themselves Kate and Margaret asking questions of the spirits and the answering thumps and noises that would respond. And Leah, the eldest sister of Margaret and Kate, also proved to have the gift when she began to communicate with the Post's deceased daughter. The Posts became caught up in this movement, probably because of the emotional connection they had to being able to communicate with somebody that they thought they would never be able to see or talk to again. So they rented out one of the largest spaces in Rochester to have the sisters get up on stage in front of a crowd and show everybody what they could do. This same night, the girls were brought into a private chamber with Amy Post accompanying them so that they could be checked basically for any kinds of tricks that they would be using in order to make these things happen. They disrobed, so their clothes were taken off and they were thoroughly checked, which I think is a little ridiculous, but they were thoroughly checked and they couldn't find anything that they could be using to make the noises and that they said were the communication of spirits. Enter Andrew Jackson Davis, who was also known as John the Baptist of the Spiritualist Movement. He lived in New York City at the time, and when word reached him about the Fox sisters, he extended a special invitation for them to come visit him. Davis and the Fox sisters, as separate entities, may never have achieved the fame and notoriety that they both went on to achieve. Davis at that time was just an unknown healer and medium living in New York City. The Fox sisters were just some young girls living in a small town in upstate New York. But together they created a movement that was really needed and well received at the time. Together they were a symbol of a new era. People were sick of the doom and gloom of the Protestant predestination, which basically meant that no matter what you do in your life, no matter how good you are, how bad you are, it's already predetermined what's going to happen to you. You don't have any control over your life, or your death, or what happens to your soul after you die. A lot of people were primed and ready for a more positive, more upbeat sort of outlook on life and death. And spiritualism gave them this. The sisters booked a room in a hotel in New York City that coincidentally belonged to a cousin of P.T. Barnum, who we all know who P.T. Barnum is, right? And they began holding daily and nightly seances. These seances would include groups of up to 30 people, and they charged $1 per person for admission. So basically, they were making a killing, right? $1 per person, per seance. If they were holding even 1 to 2 seances a day with up to 30 people, that was a lot of money in those days. Some notable historical figures who took part in these seances were Horace Greeley, who was the founder of the New York Post, a famous abolitionist, William Lloyd Garrison, and William Cullen Bryant, who was the editor of the New York Post. At one point, Leah stayed in New York City, keeping these seances going there and the money coming in there, and Margaret and Kate took the show on the road, going to many other cities and basically holding seances and charging admission there. In Philadelphia, Margaret met explorer Elisha Kent Kane, who basically didn't really believe in what she was selling, but fell in love with her anyways. He observed their performance for months, and even he admitted not believing in being able to talk to people who were dead. He admitted that he could never find the secret to how they were doing it, how they were faking it, but he thought they were faking it. Kane continued to pursue Margaret, who was 13 years younger than him, and he basically was enamored with her, and he wanted to marry her, and he wanted her to denounce her evil ways and come back to the traditional religious fold. They did end up becoming secretly married, and Margaret did become a Catholic, just to basically humor him because he was always trying to save her. But he died a short time after they got married, and Margaret was hit hard by this. She really loved him. She felt loved by him, and she started heavily drinking and vowed she would never, ever go back to spiritualism in order to honor him. Kate, on the other hand, she married a devout spiritualist, and she continued giving seances and honing her medium and psychic abilities. See, spiritualism, it became very popular in the years following the Civil War. Understandably, the Civil War was a very bloody war. More people died in the Civil War than in World War I and World War II combined. So there was a lot of pointless death that people didn't understand. So spiritualism was very attractive to these people who lost brothers and sons and husbands unexpectedly and without reason. So they wanted to be able to, one last time, contact them, communicate with them, be able to tell them they love them, be able to have some closure. These people who were suddenly hit with the hard truths of life and death, They flooded to Kate and people like Kate, and it became a little overwhelming for her. The pressure of it, the emotional outpouring from other people who were truly devastated and torn apart by this loss. It became a lot for her, and she began drinking as well. So, on October 21st, 1888, Margaret Fox, or Margaret Kent at this point, she dropped a bomb on everybody. Margaret gave the New York World an exclusive interview in exchange for the sum of $1,500. And in this interview, she denounced spiritualism, she denounced her sisters, Kate and Leah, she denounced everything about the life that she had basically led up to that point before becoming Catholic. That evening, she appeared at the New York Academy of Music, and in this appearance, she told everybody how she and her sister Kate had fooled everyone for so long. She told the origin story of how it had all started. They said it was March 31st, so it was the day before April Fool's Day, and Kate and Margaret, I guess they were bored and they wanted to mess with their parents, and they had figured out a way to tie an apple to a string and be able to pull the string in order to make the apple hit the ground and make thumps and knocking sounds. According to her, they eventually graduated from the apple trick, abandoned that, and learned how to manipulate the joints in their toes to make the thumping noises that people heard and thought were communications from the dead. As if this revelation wasn't enough, Margaret actually took off her shoe on stage in front of all those people, and she lifted her skirts up and she showed everybody how she could make the thumping sounds with her toes. Understandably, the spiritualism community was in an uproar and they immediately began taking sides. The other two Fox sisters, Kate and Leah, just claimed that Margaret was upset with them because they had publicly spoken out against how much she was drinking and claimed that she wasn't taking care of her two children. So she was bitter and she was trying to get back at them. Many people claimed Margaret was just upset because she didn't have the medium abilities anymore. She couldn't get paid for being part of the Spiritualist Movement, so she would get paid for talking out against it. A year later, Margaret took it all back. She said that her spirit guides had made her do it, essentially, so she denounced her denouncement of spiritualism. She was never really taken seriously by anyone in the movement again, and she and her sisters, they never reconciled and they never made up, which is kind of sad. Leah, she passed away in 1890, and Kate in 1892 from binge drinking. America has always symbolized freedom to those who live there or seek to. Freedom from oppression, freedom of religion, freedom to become whatever you want to become. It is not surprising that spiritualism, a movement that symbolizes freedom in its own way, would take root and grow there as it did. For so long, people had been held captive by the fear of death. If you ask anyone, death is probably one of their greatest fears. They fear the unknown element. They fear the finality. They fear the inevitability. Spiritualism freed people from this fear, giving them the hope that death wouldn't be the end. It gave them the hope that there was something after death, that maybe the completion of one's living journey on earth did not signify the completion of their soul's journey. If you look at it that way, can you really blame people for clinging on to the hope that when someone you love dies, you can still communicate with them? Or that when you die, you may still be able to cross the great unknown to tell a family member that you love them one last time? I don't know what I believe on whether the Fox sisters were actually communicating with the spirits of the dead or not. But the last part of this story may sway you one way or the other. 11 years after the last Fox sister passed, a group of children were playing in the ruins of their old home in Hydesville, New York. This house had become known to the locals as the Spook House, and as these children were playing in the ruins of the Spook House, they came across some bones. The bones were inspected, and they were discovered to belong to a man, and they were about 50 years old. The discovery of these bones kind of makes you wonder, did the Fox sisters have a link to speak with the dead? Did the Fox sisters actually talk to the spirit of a murdered salesman who was buried underneath the home? How would they have known about his existence beforehand? How would they have known that he was buried under the house? Was it just a really good guess based on rumors that they'd heard from around town? Or were they actually communicating with the spirit of this murdered peddler? It makes me wonder, at least. I always get teased by my husband because I believe in ghosts. And I don't know. It's just something that I've always believed in. I was that 11-year-old girl playing with a Ouija board in my room by myself at night, and then was so terrified of the Ouija board in my room that I couldn't sleep with it in the room anymore. So I had to take it out and put it like in a closet downstairs so that I could go to sleep in my own room at night. I will often attribute weird things that happen to the presence of spirits. For instance, while I was researching this story, a couple of weird things happened. So the first night that I was researching these things on the internet, I was actually rocking my daughter to sleep. I was putting her to bed and rocking in her rocking chair and just kind of scrolling through the internet on my phone. And I heard a loud bang outside. So I went to investigate, and I saw that there was this wooden sign, which I've placed above my son's door. It says, "You are my sunshine" on it, and it had fallen for apparently no reason. There's nobody around. I was in the other room, and my husband and my son were in a different room. Nobody was near it, so there was no reason it should have fallen. And the only other time that that sign has ever fallen off the top of that door is when I was recording another mystery video about the murder of the Tan children. And as I was saying in that video who I thought murdered the Tan children, that sign upstairs with nobody else in the house but me fell off the door. And if you watch that video, you can see, like, I was legitimately scared. I was terrified when that happened. So it was not a stunt. And the next night, I was sitting in my dining room at my dining room table on my computer doing some more research on this story, and the entire lights in the house just went out for no reason. And then, as I was writing the script and just kind of getting all my notes in order, the next day, a door slammed upstairs for no reason. It was just me in the house by myself downstairs, and my 20-month-old upstairs napping in her room. There was nobody else in the house, and a door slammed upstairs. You could say it's due to a breeze, but there's no windows open. It's the middle of October. It's cold outside. There's no windows open. Maybe it was heat from the heat vent blowing the door shut, but the heat wasn't on. So it's just a couple weird things that happen while I was looking into this story. Call it my overreactive imagination, call it my desire to know that there's something after death, but that's what happened. But I choose to believe that the end is not the end. I choose to believe that when we leave these physical bodies, something happens with all the energy, knowledge, love, and passion we gathered and built up in our minds and souls throughout our living years, that it doesn't just vanish, but instead is sent out into the universe to live on in some way. I choose to believe that, and that belief gives me hope. And it also kind of scares me. Let me know what you think. Thank you for being here with me today. I hope you enjoyed our little Halloween special. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you like videos like this and you want to see other videos like this, and I will definitely see you guys next time. Stay kind and stay beautiful. Mwah. Bye. And if I don't see you, happy Halloween.